7-year-old Jalen Brooks wore a bright red t-shirt the day a uniformed officer kicked him in his own school hallway. He didn't scream. He wanted the world to hear the man who hurt him. What happened next sparked protests in over 20 cities. Watch the full story, feel the truth, and join the movement. Subscribe now, like, and share this video so no voice or silence goes unheard. 7-year-old Jalen Brooks never thought much about the hallway between math and reading class. It was just a stretch of beige tiles lined with dented lockers, a place where shoes squeaked against the waxed floor and fluorescent lights hummed overhead. That morning, he was wearing his favorite red t-shirt, the one with the cracked basketball logo faded from too many wash cycles. It hung loosely on his small frame, but to Jalen, it felt like a little shield, a reminder of pickup games with his cousins at the park. The shirt was bright against the muted school walls, almost defiant in its color. He was standing at his locker, quietly tucking his science notebook into his backpack, when the moment came that would change not just his life, but the conversation in living rooms and newsrooms across the country. From the corner of his eye, Jalen saw the shadow before the man. Officer Brian Keller was doing what he called a routine hallway patrol, though the students knew it more as a slow, watchful glide, his boots landing heavy on the floor, his eyes scanning for something, anything, to assert himself over. Keller was tall, broad, and in his mid-40s, with the kind of jawline that always looked clenched. He wore the dark blue uniform of a police officer stationed in schools, though everyone also noticed the way his utility belt jangled just a little louder when he approached certain students. Jalen didn't know him personally, but he'd seen the officer glare at other boys in his class, and he knew enough to keep his head down. That morning, Jalen wasn't doing anything, just standing, shifting the weight of his backpack. Keller walked past one student, then another, then paused when his eyes landed on the boy in red. It was a pause that felt like the silence before a storm. Without warning, Keller stepped closer. The air between them tightened, and then, in one swift movement that looked almost casual to a passerby, Keller lifted his boot and drove it into Jalen's right side, the impact echoing up through the boy's ribs and into his breath. The pain was sharp, immediate, and shocking, not just because of its force, but because of where they were. A school hallway was supposed to be a place of safety, not a place where a child had to brace himself against violence from someone wearing a badge. Jalen's small body shifted with the kick, his left hand shooting out to catch the locker beside him so he wouldn't collapse to the ground. The locker door rattled under his palm. He could feel the heat of the strike blooming beneath his shirt, an ache that would stay with him long after the moment passed. He didn't cry out. He didn't ask why. In that second, something deep inside him told him not to give Keller what he wanted. The sound of pain, the visible proof of power. So he froze, shoulders squared, staring straight ahead at the chipped paint of the opposite wall. His breathing slowed, not because the kick didn't hurt, but because he made it slow. A choice, one that would later make all the difference. Keller muttered something under his breath as he stepped back. It was low, but not low enough. A single word, sharp and poisonous. The kind of word children aren't supposed to hear in school hallways. The kind of word that carried with it not just insult, but generations of contempt. What Keller didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that inside Jalen's backpack, zipped into a small front pocket, was a slim black audio recorder. It wasn't anything special, just something Jalen's uncle had given him months before so he could record himself practicing spelling words. But Jalen had left it running that morning, simply because he liked to listen back to his day sometimes. It caught everything: the heavy boots on the tile, the muffled shuffle of students moving out of the way, the sharp thud of the kick, Keller's voice curling around that ugly slur, and Jalen's steady, deliberate breathing in the seconds that followed. If you listened closely to the recording, you could hear the faint echo of a locker door swinging open further down the hallway, a teacher's voice calling a class to order, and the sound of Keller's boots retreating as though nothing had happened. What you couldn't hear was the way Jalen's side throbbed with every breath, or how his fingers curled into fists inside the sleeve of his hoodie after he slipped it on over his t-shirt. You couldn't hear the way he decided, in that moment, to remember every detail, not just for himself, but for someone else to hear later. The hallway swallowed the incident whole, as hallways often do. Students passed by with their heads down, some glancing quickly in Jalen's direction but saying nothing. A teacher stepped into the hallway just as Keller turned the corner, her eyes scanning without stopping long enough to ask what happened. The silence in that moment was its own kind of violence, but it was also the beginning of something else, a witness to the truth that would eventually find its way into the open. Jalen zipped up his backpack, wincing slightly at the pull in his side, and walked toward his next class without looking back. He didn't know yet that the tiny recorder had captured the exact sound of a police boot striking the ribs of a 7-year-old. He didn't know that in less than 2 weeks, millions of people would hear that sound for themselves. That red t-shirt, once just his favorite, would become a symbol, first in his neighborhood, then in his city, then in places far beyond where he'd ever been. People would wear red in his name. They would post videos in silence, holding still in the frame just as he had in the hallway. And while Jalen would be told by countless adults how brave he was, he knew it hadn't been bravery in that moment. It had been something else, a refusal. For now, though, the day continued, as if nothing had happened. Math problems on the board, the smell of pencil shavings, the low hum of the heating vents, school as usual. But in the pocket of his backpack, carried from classroom to classroom, was the piece of evidence that would tear the roof off the quiet. That was the day they kicked Jalen Brooks. The day an officer's boot met a child's ribs in the place where children are supposed to be safest. And it was the day a red t-shirt, a cracked basketball logo, and a steady breath began a story that would not be silenced. What no one realized in that moment, not Keller, not the students in the hallway, not even Jalen, was that the real power of what happened wasn't in the kick itself. It was in the fact that the sound of it would travel farther than the officer could imagine. It would echo in living rooms, in state houses, in the chambers of people who had never thought about what a school hallway could hold. And it would make them listen, not to shouting, not to chaos, but to the quiet truth of a boy who refused to break his silence. Anthony Brooks was halfway through tightening the last bolt on a rusted porch railing when his phone buzzed. It wasn't a number he recognized, but the display read, Lincoln Elementary. His pulse tightened. Not raced, just tightened. The way it used to when the police radio in his squad car crackled with a call that sounded too vague to be routine. He swiped to answer, bracing for the voice on the other end. Mr. Brooks? The tone was formal, flat. This is Assistant Principal Hayward. We need you to come down to the school. There was an incident involving Jalen. Anthony straightened up slowly, wiping his hands on the rag tucked into his back pocket. What kind of incident? A pause. Too long. A non-compliance matter. It's been handled, but we'd like to discuss it with you in person. The words were designed to be meaningless, he thought. Something bland enough to lower his guard, but just sharp enough to imply his son had done something wrong. He'd heard that kind of phrasing before, in interrogation rooms and after-action reports, where the goal was to strip the truth down to sterile language until no one could recognize it. I'll be there in 15, he said, and hung up. The drive to Lincoln Elementary took exactly 13 minutes. He didn't speed, didn't even press the gas any harder than usual, but the landscape outside the windshield seemed to roll past faster than it should. Anthony's mind was already at the school, at the front office where the smell of copier toner mixed with hand sanitizer, where staff would try to look concerned without saying too much. He'd been in enough rooms like that, on both sides of the desk, to know the choreography. When he stepped through the school's front doors, the secretary at the desk offered a thin smile and motioned toward a small conference room down the hall. Inside, the assistant principal sat across from Jalen, whose red t-shirt was now covered partially by a zipped-up hoodie. Anthony's gaze went first to his son's face, calm, but a little too still, and then to the faint smudge of dirt on the side of the hoodie, like something had pressed hard against it. "Mr. Brooks," Hayward began, "thank you for coming on such short notice. There was a situation in the hallway earlier today. Officer Keller had to address some non-compliance from Jalen and—" "Non-compliance?" Anthony's voice was steady, but the word landed in the room like a weight. "Yes, Anthony raised a hand. "Take the hoodie off, son." Jalen hesitated only a second before unzipping it. The bright red shirt underneath seemed to shout against the drab beige walls. On the right side, just above his ribs, was a faint, dusty print, the shape of a boot sole, not yet fully faded. The assistant principal's eyes flickered to it, and then away, like she was trying not to see what was directly in front of her. Anthony stepped forward, crouching slightly to be level with his son. His fingers hovered just over the mark, not touching, but close enough to see the faint outline of tread pressed into the cotton. He looked up at Hayward. "Who did this?" "Officer Keller was involved in the interaction," she said, her voice dipping at the edges. The name was like a match in Anthony's mind. Keller. Brian Keller. It had been years, but the memory was still sharp. Back when Anthony was a sergeant in the city's police department, Keller's name had crossed his desk more than once, always in the context of force complaints involving young black males, usually dismissed for lack of sufficient evidence. One case in particular stuck with him. A middle schooler whose arm had been fractured during what Keller called a restraint maneuver. Anthony had pushed the incident up the chain to internal affairs, only to have it vanish 3 weeks later, buried under unsubstantiated findings. A week after that, Anthony was advised to let it go if he wanted his career to remain intact. He didn't let it go. That choice had eventually cost him his badge. Anthony straightened, keeping his eyes locked on Hayward. "Where is Keller now?" She shifted in her chair. "He's continuing his patrol." His jaw tightened. "So, a sworn officer put his boot into my 7-year-old son, and you're telling me he's still walking the halls?" "I wouldn't characterize it that way," she said quickly. "That's because you've never had a boot print on your shirt," Anthony replied, his voice low, but carrying the kind of weight that made the room feel smaller. He turned back to Jalen. "Did he say anything?" Jalen's eyes flickered for a second before he nodded. Anthony didn't press for the words. They'd come later, when they were out of this room, away from the polite faces that didn't want the truth spoken aloud. Anthony knew better than to demand an immediate confrontation with Keller here and now. The system would only circle its wagons tighter if he came in swinging. Instead, he filed away every detail. The time, the mark on the shirt, the name, the vague language from the school. He'd learned long ago that if you want to dismantle something, you start by taking its measurements. As they left the school, Jalen walked a step behind him, silent. Anthony didn't fill the silence with questions. In his years on the force, he'd learned that the most valuable details came out when you left space for them to breathe. They reached the car, and as Jalen climbed in, Anthony caught the faintest sound, the soft whir of a small device powering down. "What's that?" Jalen unzipped his backpack just enough to show him. A small black audio recorder sat inside. Anthony's pulse ticked faster. "You had this on?" Jalen nodded. "The whole time." Anthony closed the zipper carefully, like he was sealing a vault. He didn't say, "Good job," though the words were there, heavy behind his teeth. Instead, he slid into the driver's seat, already thinking 3 steps ahead. An audio recording changes the terrain. It makes the official story harder to script. The drive home was quiet, except for the hum of the engine. Anthony's mind was already reaching backward and forward at the same time. Back to the Keller he'd known in the department. Forward to the battles he knew were coming. The uniform was supposed to represent protection, but men like Keller had turned it into armor for their own impulses. Anthony had worn that uniform once. He knew its weight, its rules, and its loopholes, and he knew exactly how to use that knowledge against the kind of man who had just put his boot into a child's ribs. By the time they pulled into their driveway, Anthony had made a decision. This wouldn't be handled quietly. Not this time. Anthony Brooks had always believed that in every closed system there was at least one person willing to leave a door unlocked, if you knew how to knock the right way. In his years as a police sergeant, that principle had helped him slip past stonewalling supervisors and sealed case files. Now, as he sat at the kitchen table with Jalen's backpack between them, he knew that the same principle would have to apply to this school. The difference was, this time it wasn't about clearing a case. It was about his son. The small black audio recorder lay in his palm, warm from being run nearly the entire school day. He clicked it on and let the sound fill the room. First, there was the hollow hum of fluorescent lights. Then, faint footsteps on polished tile. And then, without warning, the solid, unmistakable thud of a boot meeting a small body. Anthony's hand flexed involuntarily at the sound. A beat later, the voice, Brian Keller's voice, low and close, curling around a slur that carried more than just insult. Jalen's breathing came next. Slow, deliberate, the way someone breathes when they're holding themselves together. Anthony had heard confessions, threats, and dying words on tape before. But this was different. This wasn't just evidence. This was a heartbeat caught in a net. He didn't have the visual yet, but he knew where to get it. Lincoln Elementary had a modest network of hallway surveillance cameras, nothing high-end, but enough to capture the essentials. The feeds ran through the school's IT office, overseen by a man named Reggie Vaughn. Anthony remembered Reggie from a community safety meeting the previous year, a quiet guy in his mid-30s with a habit of wearing retro video game t-shirts under his cardigans. Reggie was the kind of man who noticed things, but didn't talk about them unless he trusted you. Anthony found him after hours, the IT office dimly lit, except for the glow of 2 monitors. "Reggie," he said by way of greeting. Reggie glanced up, eyes narrowing just slightly, before he waved Anthony inside. "This about your kid?" Anthony nodded. "You hear anything?" Reggie's fingers paused over the keyboard. "I heard enough. The cameras caught it." Anthony leaned on the desk. "I need that footage." Reggie exhaled slowly, glancing toward the closed door. "You know I can't just hand it over." "Officially." "I'm not asking officially," Anthony said. "I'm asking as a father. And I'm telling you, if it disappears, Keller walks. You know how that plays out." The silence stretched, punctuated by the hum of a server in the corner. Then Reggie swiveled in his chair and began typing. "Give me a minute." The footage appeared on the left monitor, a fixed hallway shot, time-stamped in the corner. They watched as Jalen appeared, red shirt vivid even in the grainy frame. Keller entered seconds later, his shadow stretching long before he came into view. The kick was quick, almost casual. But in the way Jalen's body jerked and steadied, in the way his hand shot to the locker for balance, the violence was undeniable. Keller's head tilted down toward him, his lips moving. Even without the audio, Anthony knew what those words were. Reggie copied the segment onto a flash drive. "You didn't get this from me." Anthony pocketed it. "No one will know, but they'll see it." Back home, he synced the video with Jalen's audio. The result was damning. Sight and sound woven together so tightly there was no space for excuses. The image of the boot rising, the sharp crack of impact, the muttered slur, and Jalen's controlled breath. All of it told the truth in a way that neither could alone. Anthony watched it twice, then closed the file. It wasn't something you could watch over and over without it doing damage. He knew exactly who should see it first. Leah Porter. Leah had once covered City Hall scandals for the Metro Sentinel, where she'd earned a reputation for cutting through press release smog like a scalpel. Anthony had met her years earlier during a police oversight investigation. She was relentless, but more importantly, she understood the difference between a story and a spectacle. This needed to be both, and in the right hands, it could be. When he called her, she picked up on the second ring. "Anthony Brooks, haven't heard from you since you blew up that precinct audit. I've got something you need to see," he said. "You always say that," she teased. "This time it's my kid." The humor drained from her voice. "Send it!" He encrypted the file and sent it to her secure inbox. 10 minutes later, his phone buzzed again. "Jesus, Anthony," she said, no preamble. There's no way they spin this." "They'll try," he said. "Then we don't give them time to. I can have this up within 24 hours. But when it goes, it's going everywhere." Good. That's the point. By the next evening, Leah had cut a tight 2-minute segment from the footage. She didn't add narration, just a title card. 7-year-old assaulted by school police officer. In the bottom corner, she placed a hashtag, Reacher Red Shirt Kid. It hit the internet at 7:03 p.m. Within the first hour, it had been retweeted over 2,000 times. By midnight, the number had tripled. People weren't just sharing the video. They were freezing frames of Jalen standing still, of the boot in motion, of the moment Keller's head dipped toward him. They were pairing them with their own stories of school police overreach, their own bruises, their own red shirts. By morning, local news stations were looping the clip, the hashtag crawling across the screen. National outlets picked it up by late afternoon, splicing it into broader conversations about police in schools. Commentators debated the context, but the footage didn't leave much room. Every replay was the same. A boy in a red t-shirt, a kick, a slur, a breath held steady. Anthony watched the coverage from his living room, Jalen sitting quietly beside him. The boy didn't smile or frown, just watched, as if studying how the world was choosing to see him. Anthony put a hand on his shoulder. "This is just the start," he said. It was. Calls poured in, from civil rights lawyers, from advocacy groups, from parents whose children had been on the receiving end of similar non-compliance corrections. People began showing up outside Lincoln Elementary wearing red t-shirts, standing silently in the mornings before the first bell. Some carried signs, but most just stood. The stillness was the statement. Keller, Anthony learned, had been placed on temporary administrative leave, which was bureaucratic code for stay home until the heat dies down. But the heat wasn't dying. It was spreading. Anthony knew they'd try to weather it, to shift the conversation, maybe even to dig into his past and smear his name. He didn't care. The evidence was out there now, in too many hands to bury. The beauty of it, Anthony thought, was that the system's own tools had turned against it. The camera they installed to watch the students had recorded the man they trusted to guard them. The audio his son had carried for his own reasons had caught the officer's intent in his own voice. Paired together, they were undeniable. Evidence, Anthony knew, was supposed to be controlled, catalogued, sequestered, locked behind chain of custody forms. But this evidence had slipped the leash. It was already too public, too raw, too real to be massaged into a palatable narrative. And once something like that escaped, there was no pulling it back. Anthony Brooks had always believed that if you want to understand a man, you don't look at his uniform, you look at the trail he leaves behind. In policing, that trail is paper. Incident reports, complaint forms, internal memos. Most people never get to see it, and that's exactly how men like Brian Keller survive. But after the Red Shirt Kid video detonated across the internet, Anthony knew the next step wasn't just to keep the outrage burning. It was to feed it with something that could not be dismissed as a bad moment. He needed to show a pattern. That's where Marcus Bell came in. Marcus was a civil rights attorney with a mind like a scalpel, precise, cutting, deliberate. He'd built his career on cases where the official story dissolved under the weight of its own contradictions. Anthony had worked with him once before, years ago, on a wrongful arrest suit. Marcus had won it, and the department had quietly written a check to make it go away. But Keller's case wasn't going to be quiet. They met in Marcus's office, a narrow room lined with case binders and framed front pages from newspapers that had once called him relentless. Marcus leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, as Anthony explained everything: the kick, the slur, the audio, the video, the history that Anthony could half remember from his time on the force. "I can get you the proof," Marcus said, "but it won't be through official channels. The department will fight tooth and nail to protect this guy. Not because they like him, but because they can't afford the precedent." Anthony nodded. "So we go unofficial." Unofficial meant calling in favors, leaning on people who had access to things they shouldn't be sharing. Marcus started with a contact in the city's records department, someone who could slip them Keller's complaint history. It took 3 days and 1 encrypted courier. But when the file arrived, it was thick, over 24 documented complaints spanning more than a decade. The pattern was unmistakable. Almost every incident involved a black boy between the ages of 10 and 15. The language was nearly identical in each report. Subject was non-compliant. Minimal force was used to gain compliance. No injuries observed. Anthony flipped through the pages, jaw tightening. "This is boilerplate," he said. "They've been copy-pasting this crap for years." Marcus pointed to the outcome column on each complaint. Dismissed. Lack of sufficient evidence. Closed. Subject unwilling to cooperate. No further action warranted. "That's the game," Marcus said. "They write it in a way that guarantees it goes nowhere. And most of these kids, they don't have parents who can fight it. Hell, half of them probably don't even know they had the right to." But paper wasn't enough. Anthony knew the public would see the words and understand the system, but they wouldn't feel it unless they could see the faces. That's when he started making calls to people he remembered from those long-ago complaints. The parents who had once begged him to do something. The first was Carla Rivers, whose son Darnell had been thrown against a wall at 12 for refusing to follow hallway procedure. Carla answered the phone with a cautious hello, but when Anthony explained what he was doing, her voice sharpened with something between relief and rage. "I still have the photos," she said. "They told me to destroy them, but I couldn't." She sent them that night, grainy but clear. Darnell with a deep purple bruise blooming along his temple, his eyes swollen from crying. The timestamp was from 9 years earlier, but the injury looked fresh. Then came Luis Ortega's mother, who had fought for weeks to get a copy of her son's medical report after he slipped on the school stairs. She had been told Keller wasn't even on duty that day, but Luis had whispered his name through split lips in the ER. She still had the hospital photos. A fractured wrist, abrasions up one side of his face. One by one, the images arrived. Some digital, some sent by overnight courier, some handed over in person by parents who met Anthony in parking lots and coffee shops. Each one carried a story, and each story echoed the others. Keller's temper, the physical correction, the immediate shift to official language that stripped away the violence and replaced it with procedure. Leah Porter joined them in Marcus's office one night as they laid the photos across the table. She walked slowly around the display, saying nothing at first. When she finally spoke, her voice was tight. "You put these alongside the complaints. You've got a visual history of abuse that's been hiding in plain sight. People think the video of Jalen is shocking. Wait until they realize it wasn't the first time, or the 5th, or the 15th. Marcus looked at Anthony. "We release it all, timeline it, complaint, date, age of the kid, Keller's own words, the outcome, and the photo. Lay it out so even the most stubborn skeptic can't say this was an isolated thing." Anthony thought about Keller reading it, seeing his record turned into a public map of harm. "Yeah," he said, "we showed them the trail. They worked for hours, piecing it together." Leah built a scrolling, interactive page that moved like a grim calendar. Each entry marked with a red dot, each red dot opening into a complaint summary and the corresponding photo. At the top, in bold white letters over a black background, was the headline, "Before Red Shirt Kid, there was this." The page went live at 8:15 a.m. on a Wednesday. By lunchtime, it had been shared over 50,000 times. By nightfall, several of the boys, now young men, were posting their own accounts on social media, their childhood photos alongside the newer ones. The stories varied in detail, but the rhythm was the same. Keller had singled them out, hurt them, and walked away untouched. Cable news picked it up within 48 hours. Civil rights groups began calling for Keller's arrest, not just suspension. Editorials appeared in major papers demanding to know why a man with that record had been kept in schools for over a decade. The department issued a terse statement claiming they were reviewing the new information. But Anthony recognized the tone. It was the sound of a wall starting to crack. In the days that followed, more families came forward. Some didn't have photos, but they had hospital bills, written apologies from principals, or simply their own testimony. Each one added to the weight pressing down on the department. And through it all, Anthony kept thinking about something his father used to say. "The truth's a funny thing. It doesn't just set you free, it traps the people who've been running from it." Keller had been running for a long time. Now, the trail was lit up for everyone to see. The louder the truth rang, the more desperate Brian Keller became to smother it. 3 days after Leah's interactive exposé went live, the department released a statement attributed to Keller himself. It read like every defensive report Anthony had ever seen. Sterile, calculated, dripping with that careful vagueness meant to reshape reality. "On the date in question," Keller wrote, "I was conducting routine patrol when the student in question became agitated and lunged in my direction. In the interest of safety and to gain compliance, minimal physical force was applied." Minimal force. Lunged. Anthony could almost hear Keller's voice in those words, the same voice caught on Jalen's recorder, muttering a slur right after the kick. The statement was meant for people who hadn't seen the footage, for those who could be persuaded that a 7-year-old in a bright red T-shirt was a credible threat to a grown man in uniform. But what Keller hadn't counted on was the release of the uncut hallway footage, a version that didn't just show the kick, but everything leading up to it. In the full video, Jalen is still. His hands are busy with the zipper on his backpack. Keller approaches without any visible provocation. There is no sudden movement, no lunge, no threat, just the officer's boot rising and striking with casual precision. Leah pushed the full video out within hours of Keller's statement, attaching only 3 words above it. Watch for yourself. In less than 24 hours, it had over 2 million views. The comment sections filled with disbelief and fury. Teachers wrote that they'd seen similar incidents go unreported for years. Parents posted that they would never send their children into a hallway patrolled by someone like Keller. And then the silence began. It started with a group of 8th graders at Lincoln Elementary. The morning after the uncut footage dropped, they showed up to school in red T-shirts, plain, bright, unmistakable. At the first passing period, they positioned themselves against the walls of the main hallway, standing shoulder to shoulder, facing straight ahead. They didn't speak. They didn't hold signs. They didn't chant. They simply stood there, eyes fixed forward, as Keller's fellow officers walked past during patrol. By the second day, the group had doubled. By the third, nearly every student in the building had joined in, their red shirts forming an unbroken line that stretched from one end of the hallway to the other. Even first graders, too small for adult-sized shirts, wore red fabric draped like capes over their shoulders. Teachers didn't stop them. Some even joined in, taking up positions at the ends of the hall. The silence was unnerving. Officers were used to shouts, arguments, protests they could label as disruptive and disperse. But this was different. The quiet was disciplined, heavy, impossible to misinterpret. Every time an officer passed, the line of students didn't move, didn't blink. It was as if the hallway itself had turned into a witness stand. Local reporters began showing up outside the school, capturing footage of the red shirt line during the morning bell. The images spread online, the hashtag #JatChuRedShirtKid evolving into #JatChuFute Red Shirt Line. Soon, other schools in the district joined in, their students sending photos of their own silent hallway vigils. Within a week, schools in neighboring states were participating, the red shirts becoming a national symbol of defiance without a single shouted word. Anthony watched it unfold with a mix of pride and grief. Pride that his son's steadiness, the same unflinching calm he'd shown after the kick, had inspired something so powerful. Grief that it had taken violence against a child to bring this movement to life. He saw the way the silence made the officers uncomfortable. In the videos, they avoided eye contact, their strides a little quicker when passing the red-shirted lines. Some shifted their gaze to the floor, pretending to be focused on their patrols. Keller, of course, avoided the school entirely. Officially, he was still on administrative leave. But Anthony knew the real reason. He couldn't risk walking that hallway now. The sight of dozens of children in the same bright color as the shirt he'd kicked would have been damning even without a camera. The department tried to counter the protests by framing them as a distraction from the learning environment. A memo was sent to parents warning that organized demonstrations could lead to disciplinary action, but that only strengthened the resolve. Students showed up in red anyway, and when some were told to change shirts, they improvised with red paper taped over their clothing, red markers scrawled across their sleeves, even red ribbons tied around their arms. Leah covered the protests in a follow-up article, highlighting the discipline and unity of the students. She included quotes from parents, teachers, and even a few administrators who spoke anonymously in support. "They've figured out how to hold the system accountable without giving it a reason to punish them," one teacher said. "It's the smartest protest I've ever seen." The silence was contagious. Outside the school, rallies formed where hundreds would gather wearing red and simply stand, heads high, eyes forward. No bullhorns, no speeches, just the weight of collective stillness. The visual was striking on the evening news. A sea of red against the backdrop of city buildings. A quiet that spoke louder than any chant. Anthony knew the movement was bigger than him now, bigger than Jalen. It had taken on a life of its own, driven by the simple truth that once you've seen something clearly, You can't unsee it. The footage had shown what Keller did, but the silence was showing what it meant. Behind closed doors, Anthony heard through his contacts that the department was fracturing. Some officers wanted Keller gone immediately, worried about their own reputations. Others dug in, claiming he was being railroaded by the court of public opinion. But the protests made it harder to stand with him without looking complicit. Every hallway lined with red shirts was a reminder of exactly who was being protected and who was being targeted. Late one evening, Anthony stood in Jalen's doorway, watching his son sleep. The red shirt, the same one from that day, was folded neatly on his dresser. It was washed now, the faint boot print gone, but Anthony still saw it. He suspected he always would. He thought about how silence had been used for so long to cover the truth, to let people like Keller walk away untouched. But now, that same silence had been reclaimed, turned into a weapon sharper than any headline. And Anthony knew, with absolute certainty, that Keller would never outrun it. It began as a trickle, one or two messages landing in Anthony's inbox from names he half recognized. But within a week of the red shirt protests, it was a flood. The subject lines read like a ledger of buried harm. "He hurt me too. I thought I was the only one. This is about Keller." Anthony opened each one carefully, sometimes bracing himself before clicking play on attached voice memos or downloading old photographs. Every new account pulled another hidden thread into the light, weaving a pattern that was impossible to ignore. The first was from Darnell Rivers, now 21. Anthony remembered Darnell's mother, Carla, from the early days of his own investigation, her voice tight with frustration as she described an incident at Lincoln Middle School that the principal had written off. Darnell's email was short, just a few lines. "When I was 12, Keller threw me against the wall outside the gym because I was late to class. My head hit the cinder block so hard, I saw black. They called it a discipline issue." Attached was a photo from that week, Darnell in a faded hoodie, a jagged bruise running along his temple. Then came Luis Ortega. His message was longer, detailed. "They said it was a playground accident," he wrote. "Said I tripped on the stairs. But everybody in my class knew Keller shoved me. I had a fractured wrist, a swollen cheek, and the nurse told me not to tell my parents exactly what happened." Luis had kept the original injury report, printed on the school's letterhead. In bold letters, it read, "Cause, playground accident." But in the margins, in faint pencil, someone had scrawled the word stairs. Anthony forwarded each case to Marcus Bell, who had already started building a private spreadsheet. It wasn't just the names and dates, it was the details, the language. "Look at this," Marcus said one night, leaning over his laptop. "Same phrasing, same justifications. Every one of these reports says minimal force or student non-compliant. It's like they've been copying and pasting for over a decade." As the spreadsheet grew, Leah Porter joined them at Marcus's office to plan the next move. She paced as they talked, glancing at the rows of names and the growing column of linked evidence, photos, reports, medical records, handwritten notes from parents. "This isn't a list anymore," Leah said. "It's a database. And it's not just for us. It's for everyone. People need to see this pattern, not as scattered incidents, but as a single, continuous story." They decided to go public. But instead of releasing it as a static document, Leah built something dynamic, an interactive timeline and map that plotted each case by year and location. Each red marker on the map opened to a survivor's account, often paired with scanned documents or photographs. At the top of the page was the title, "The Keller File, a Decade of Harm Hidden in Plain Sight." Darnell's entry sat in the 2014 slot, his photo and brief statement alongside a scanned copy of the complaint his mother had filed. which, of course, had been marked closed, insufficient evidence. Luis's entry was marked 2016, his injury report beside a witness statement from a former classmate who finally spoke up after seeing the protests online. The database didn't just cover Keller's school assignments. Some cases reached back to his early patrol days in the city, street stops that turned violent, complaints filed by teenagers who had since aged into adulthood, all dismissed under the same vague, protective language. When the site went live, it was like lighting a fuse. Advocacy groups picked it up immediately, sharing the link alongside demands for a full criminal investigation. Survivors who hadn't spoken before now had a place to submit their accounts directly, and each new submission was reviewed, verified, and added to the growing record. Within 72 hours, the list had expanded from a dozen cases to more than 30. Cable news anchors displayed screenshots of the database during prime time. One segment on a national morning show walked through the pattern year by year, pointing out how Keller's transfers between schools always coincided with fresh complaints. Complaints that mysteriously disappeared from official files. The implication was clear. Keller hadn't been disciplined. He'd been moved, like a stain shuffled around a carpet, until it faded from view. Anthony watched the coverage from his living room, Jalen curled against his side. The boy's eyes were fixed on the TV as they showed Darnell's photo, then Luis's, then others. Anthony didn't shield him from it. This was the truth, and Jalen had lived his own part of it. Messages started pouring in from parents, teachers, even a few officers who claimed they'd tried to speak up over the years, but were silenced. One former school administrator admitted off the record that Keller's file had been managed to avoid lawsuits. They called it protecting the district, the man said in a recorded interview, but it was just protecting him. The growing database became a kind of public courtroom, one that didn't need permission to open its doors. People scrolled through it late at night, clicking from case to case, seeing the same officer's name appear over and over. The sheer repetition was damning. No amount of departmental spin could explain away a decade's worth of bruises, fractures, and accidents that all pointed to the same man. For Anthony, the database wasn't just about exposing Keller. It was about proving something bigger. That this was never one bad apple. Never one isolated mistake. It was a system built to absorb the damage, to reroute the blame, until no single incident seemed big enough to fight. But when laid end to end, those incidents formed a chain, and every link had Keller's fingerprints on it. The silence that had filled the school hallways now seemed to echo online. There were no shouting matches in the comment sections, just wave after wave of red shirt profile pictures, survivor testimonies, and quiet affirmations from strangers. We believe you. We see you. We're not forgetting. By the end of the week, the state's attorney general announced that his office was reviewing the compiled evidence for potential criminal charges. It was a cautious statement, but Anthony heard the shift in it. Proof that the wall Keller had been hiding behind for years was starting to crack under the weight of too much truth. And in that moment, Anthony knew they'd passed a point of no return. This wasn't just about getting Keller out of a school. It was about pulling the thread all the way, even if it unraveled everything it touched. It was less than 2 weeks after the Keller file went public when the conversation shifted from outrage to law. Anthony hadn't expected it to happen so fast. Policy change usually crawled, especially when it came to police accountability. But Jalen's case, and the sheer weight of the survivors' stories, had lit a fire that even seasoned lawmakers couldn't ignore. By the time the red shirt protests hit their 3rd week, Anthony was getting calls from state representatives asking if they could use his son's name in a bill they were drafting. They wanted to call it the Jalen Brooks Act. The proposed law was bold in a way that made Anthony pause the first time he read it. It didn't just call for tighter rules, it went for the root. The bill banned active-duty police officers from serving as in-school security personnel, replacing them with trained, unarmed safety monitors under the authority of school districts rather than police departments. It also required that any incident involving a minor and a uniformed officer, whether in a school hallway, at a playground, or during a traffic stop, be reviewed by an independent civilian oversight board with subpoena power and no ties to law enforcement. When Marcus Bell got his hands on the draft, he let out a low whistle. This is the kind of thing they'll fight tooth and nail. It cuts into their territory, their control. But if it passes... He tapped the page. It changes the game. Anthony thought about the timing, about whether putting Jalen's name on something this public would weigh on him for the rest of his life. But when he asked his son about it, Jalen just shrugged and said, "If it means they can't do this to other kids, yeah." His voice was calm, but Anthony saw the steel behind it. The bill's sponsors, 3 Democrats and, to everyone's surprise, 1 Republican from a rural district, held a press conference on the Capitol steps. Behind them stood a row of students in red shirts, silent as cameras flashed. The lead sponsor, Representative Karen Willis, didn't mince words. What happened to Jalen Brooks was not an accident, and it was not an isolated incident, she said. It was the predictable result of putting armed law enforcement in environments where children should be learning and growing, not fearing for their safety. The Jalen Brooks Act ensures that schools remain places of education, not policing, and that when harm does occur, it is investigated by people who serve the public, not protect the institution. The speech lit up social media, but it also lit up the opposition. Within hours, police unions across the state began issuing statements condemning the bill. The largest union's president went on morning radio to call it a dangerous overreach that ties officers' hands and makes schools less safe. Others painted it as an anti-police stunt designed to score political points in an election year. Cable news split the story down the middle. One network running testimonials from survivors and child psychologists backing the bill. Another hosting panel debates where former officers warned of chaos in the hallways without armed presence. The phrase "ties officers' hands" became the opposition's rallying cry, repeated in interviews, op-eds, and union newsletters. But something about the public mood was different this time. When those words hit, they didn't land the way they used to. Parents flooded comment sections asking why officers' hands needed to be free to put boots into children's sides. Teachers wrote open letters describing how armed policing had made their classrooms more hostile, not safer. Survivors of school-based incidents, many unrelated to Keller, began sharing their own stories online. Stories that made it clear Jalen's case was just the tip of the iceberg. Public support for the bill surged. A statewide poll taken the week after the press conference showed 68% of voters, across party lines, favored removing armed police from schools. The number jumped to 74% among parents with school-aged children. Anthony found himself pulled deeper into the legislative fight than he'd ever intended. He testified before the State Education Committee, recounting the moment he first saw the boot mark on Jalen's shirt. He played the audio recording for the room, letting the thud and Keller's muttered slur hang in the air longer than was comfortable. "If you can listen to that and still think this bill ties the wrong hands," he told them, "then I don't know what kind of safety you believe in." Marcus Bell testified too, walking lawmakers through the Keller file, how every complaint, every injury, had been filtered through the same internal system that led nowhere. You cannot reform a process that was never designed to hold anyone accountable, he said. You have to replace it. The hearings were tense. Union representatives showed up in full dress uniforms, flanked by officers who stood silently at the back of the room. Their presence was meant to be intimidating, but the effect was dulled by the quiet row of red-shirted students sitting in the front, their eyes fixed straight ahead in that same steady way that had defined the protests from the start. When the bill cleared committee by a narrow vote, the unions escalated. They organized a rally at the Capitol. Officers bussed in from across the state, waving signs that read, "Don't handcuff school safety." But the counter-demonstration, held on the same day, was larger. Hundreds of students, parents, and educators filling the opposite steps in red. The two groups faced each other across the lawn, neither side chanting, the air thick with a tension that cameras couldn't quite capture. Leah Porter covered it live, her camera panning slowly from the wall of uniforms to the wall of red shirts. "This," she said into her mic, "is the question our state has to answer. Who do we believe schools are for?" As the legislative session drew to a close, the final vote loomed. Anthony barely slept the night before. When the bill passed, by a margin of just 4 votes, the chamber erupted in noise, but the red shirt section stayed silent, standing as one before filing out. Outside, reporters swarmed the bill's sponsors. Representative Willis, her voice hoarse from days of debate, said simply, "The Jalen Brooks Act is not the end of the work, but it is the end of pretending that what happened to Jalen was acceptable." For Anthony, the passage was bittersweet. He knew the unions would challenge it in court. He knew some districts would drag their feet on compliance. But the law was on the books now, and that meant the next Keller who stepped into a school would do so without a badge or a gun, and with the knowledge that an independent board was watching. That night, Anthony sat with Jalen on the porch. The boy didn't say much, just leaned against his father's side. Across the street, a neighbor's porch light cast a faint red glow on the pavement. Someone had covered it with fabric in quiet solidarity. "They named it after you," Anthony said softly. Jalen nodded. "Yeah, but it's not just for me." Anthony looked out at the street, thinking of all the names in the database, all the faces in those grainy photographs. "No," he said. "It's for every kid they thought wouldn't be heard." And for the first time since that day in the hallway, Anthony let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, they had changed the ending. The trial had been building like a storm for months, but no one, not even Anthony, could have predicted the moment that would finally break Brian Keller. It came on the 3rd day of witness testimony, after hours of combative cross-examinations and carefully guarded answers from current officers. The prosecution called Ralph Henderson, a name that barely registered with most of the reporters in the room. To the public, he was just a former colleague. To Anthony, he was a shock. Ralph had worn the same uniform as Keller for years, a man who, back when Anthony was still on the force, kept his head down and his mouth shut. But when Ralph walked into the courtroom, his posture told a different story. He didn't slouch. He didn't glance at Keller. He looked straight ahead, jaw set, as though he'd been waiting years for this moment. The prosecutor started gently, asking about Ralph's time as a school resource officer, his patrol assignments, the years he overlapped with Keller. Ralph's voice was steady as he described the routine, the morning walkthroughs, the cafeteria duty, the moments between classes when officers interacted with kids. Then the questions tightened. "During your time working alongside Officer Keller," the prosecutor asked, "did he ever make statements about how he approached interactions with students?" Ralph paused. You could feel the weight of the room shift, every juror leaning forward just slightly. "Yes," he said finally. "More than once." "What kinds of statements?" Ralph exhaled slowly, eyes flicking briefly toward the jury before settling on the prosecutor. "He used to say, and I'm quoting here, 'You've got to put these kids in their place before they get ideas.'" A murmur rippled through the courtroom, and the judge banged his gavel for order. The prosecutor nodded. When he said, "these kids," who was he referring to? Ralph didn't hesitate. "Black boys. Always black boys. He'd joke about it sometimes, but most of the time he meant it. He'd say things like, "You get them early. They don't grow into a problem." Anthony felt his fists tighten in his lap. It wasn't just confirmation. It was the unfiltered truth, the ideology behind the pattern they'd been exposing for months. This wasn't just about Keller losing his temper. It was about a deliberate, targeted belief that had been allowed to roam hallways in a uniform. The prosecutor pressed further. Did he ever discuss specific incidents? Ralph nodded. He bragged about them. He'd talk about how he handled a mouthy kid, or how he made sure someone remembered the lesson. Once, in the break room, he laughed about kicking a boy in a red shirt and said, and again, this is a quote, "Didn't even cry, just stood there." That's how you know you got to him. The silence after that sentence was suffocating. You could hear the hum of the ceiling lights, the faint shuffle of someone's shoe against the floor. Anthony didn't move. Jalen, seated beside him, stared down at his folded hands. Keller's attorney leapt up, objecting on the grounds of hearsay and character assassination. But the judge overruled. Ralph's testimony stood. From that point on, Keller's composure began to crack. He stopped meeting his lawyer's eye, his jaw flexing as Ralph described more incidents, times when Keller used force for no reason, times when parents were pressured into not filing complaints, times when other officers looked the other way, because speaking up would have made them targets too. By the end of Ralph's testimony, the pattern wasn't just visible. It was undeniable. It wasn't a spreadsheet anymore. It was a living, breathing account from someone who had been inside the same walls, who had heard the jokes, seen the smirks, and understood exactly what they meant. When the jury was dismissed for the day, Anthony watched Keller rise from the defense table. His face was pale, his movements tight. For the first time since the trial began, he didn't look like a man convinced he'd walk free. He looked like someone who knew the door was closing. 2 days later, the grand jury returned its decision. Keller was indicted on multiple counts of assault, battery, and civil rights violations, charges that carried the possibility of decades in prison. The indictment document, made public within hours, cited Ralph Henderson's testimony by name, calling it credible, corroborated, and indicative of a pattern of racially motivated misconduct. The news spread like wildfire. Outside the courthouse, red-shirted supporters gathered in a silent line that stretched for nearly 2 city blocks. Cameras caught the moment the announcement was read over a loudspeaker, the brief flicker of relief on parents' faces, the quiet nods between strangers who had been waiting years for someone to say, in the language of law, that what happened to their children mattered. Leah Porter was there too, her camera sweeping over the crowd before landing on Anthony. "What does this mean to you?" she asked quietly. Anthony took a breath, glancing toward the courthouse doors. "It means the story doesn't end with a hallway and a kick. It means the system that kept him safe is finally being asked to answer for it. And it means my son, and every kid like him, gets to see that silence isn't the only option." But even in that moment of victory, Anthony knew the fight wasn't over. Trials could twist. Public attention could fade. Keller's defense team would throw everything they had at discrediting witnesses, questioning motives, muddying the waters until jurors weren't sure of anything. What Ralph's testimony had done, though, was something no legal maneuver could erase. It had given the jury a glimpse into Keller's mind. They weren't just being asked to judge an action, they were being asked to judge an intent. And intent, once revealed, had a way of burning itself into memory. As Anthony left the courthouse that day, Jalen's small hand in his, he glanced back at the stone steps where the crowd still stood. The red shirts caught the late afternoon light, glowing almost like embers. And for the first time since the day he saw that boot print on his son's shirt, Anthony felt certain that the fire wouldn't go out. Not this time. The verdict landed like a gavel strike on the entire country. Guilty, on all counts. Brian Keller was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, his eyes fixed somewhere far ahead, refusing to meet the stares from the gallery. Outside, the crowd of red shirts, hundreds strong, stood silent until the courthouse doors closed behind him. Then, slowly, a ripple of applause spread. Not celebratory, but resolute, like the sound of something heavy being set down after years of carrying it. But what had begun as one boy in a hallway was no longer confined to Lincoln Elementary, or even the state. The movement had already crossed city and state lines during the trial, and now, with Keller's conviction, it became something larger still. Schools from Boston to Oakland announced Red Shirt Days, where students, teachers, and parents wore bright crimson in solidarity with victims of police abuse. Youth centers held forums on community safety, pairing survivors with advocates to push for reforms that went beyond the Jalen Brooks Act. Even city councils in places Anthony had never visited passed resolutions recognizing the day, not as a holiday, but as a commitment to watch, listen, and hold power accountable. Anthony saw it everywhere. Photos online of classrooms where every child's shirt glowed against the backdrop of whiteboards and posters. High school basketball teams warming up in custom red jerseys with "Still Standing" stitched along the hem. Small-town libraries hanging banners in their windows. The color had become its own language, one that needed no slogans to be understood. By the time Jalen turned 15, the invitations started arriving. Requests for him to speak at rallies, on panels, in auditoriums packed with students his age and younger. For years, Anthony had shielded him from microphones and cameras, letting others tell the story. But one spring afternoon, standing backstage at a youth summit in Chicago, Jalen told his father he was ready. When he walked out, the crowd rose, a wave of red lifting to meet him. He didn't fidget. He didn't rush. He stood behind the podium, the same calm in his eyes that Anthony had seen in that grainy hallway footage years before. "I've been quiet for a long time," he began. His voice was steady, clear. "People always asked me why I didn't scream or cry or yell that day. But I didn't yell because I wanted the world to hear him, not me. I wanted you to hear exactly how it sounded when someone with power thought they could get away with it. And now you've all heard it." The room stayed silent. Not the heavy silence of fear, but the kind that means people are holding on to every word. "I'm not here to talk about me," Jalen continued. "I'm here because this red shirt means I'm not the only one. It means there are people everywhere who saw something wrong and didn't look away. It means we're still standing, and we're not going anywhere." The applause that followed wasn't loud so much as it was lasting. It swelled, filled the space, and refused to fade until Jalen stepped down from the stage. Anthony, watching from the wings, felt something he hadn't in years. Not just pride, but a sense of closure that didn't come from a verdict or a law, but from seeing his son speak his own truth on his own terms. Months later, on the anniversary of the day Keller kicked Jalen, the school unveiled a mural in the very hallway where it had happened. The artist, one of Leah Porter's friends, had studied every frame of the footage, but she didn't paint Jalen as the boy frozen against the wall. She painted him standing tall, shoulders back, looking straight ahead. His red t-shirt was bright, the cracked basketball logo visible but not broken. Behind him, silhouettes of other children stretched into the distance, their shirts blending into his like a single unbroken line. Above the image, in bold white letters, were the words, "We're still standing." The unveiling drew students, parents, teachers, and neighbors. Some had been there that day years ago. Others only knew the story from the videos and articles that had traveled across the country. The hallway smelled faintly of fresh paint, and the afternoon light from the high windows caught the red in the mural so that it seemed to glow. Anthony stood off to the side, letting others take in the image first. He saw kids pressing their hands lightly to the wall, tracing the edge of Jalen's painted shirt, as though it were a shield. He heard one boy whisper to another, "That's him. That's the kid." Jalen didn't say much during the ceremony. He smiled when people asked for photos, nodded when teachers thanked him. But when the crowd began to thin, he lingered in front of the mural. Anthony walked over, expecting his son to be ready to leave. Instead, Jalen said quietly, "It's weird, seeing it like this." "How so?" Anthony asked. "It's not about the kick anymore," Jalen said, eyes still on the wall. "It's about what happened after." Anthony nodded, feeling the truth of it settle in his chest. The hallway that had once held the sound of that boot now held something else, something permanent, visible, and louder than any shout. In the years to come, Anthony knew the fight would continue. There would be new names, new laws to pass, new people trying to roll back the progress made, but there would also be red shirts. Too many to ignore, too many to erase. And every time someone asked what it meant, the answer would be the same. We're still standing. Jalen Brooks's story is not just about one hallway, one kick, or one officer. It is about the America we live in, the systems we inherit, and the choices we make as citizens. It's a reminder that injustice rarely begins with the headline that shocks us. It starts quietly, in the moments we don't see, in the paperwork we never read, in the complaints that vanish before we know they exist. For decades, officers like Brian Keller were protected not because they were right, but because the system was built to absorb their wrongs. The lesson is clear. Silence is not neutral. It is permission. And permission is how harm becomes policy. We can't undo the past for Jalen, Darnell, Luis, or the dozens of others whose names filled the Keller file, but we can decide what happens next. Every parent, teacher, student, and neighbor has a role in demanding that schools are places of learning, not fear. Every voter has the power to push for laws like the Jalen Brooks Act, to demand civilian oversight, and to strip away the shields that hide misconduct. And every one of us must remember that democracy doesn't just live in Washington. It lives in our city councils, school boards, and courtrooms. This isn't a fight that ends with one verdict or one bill. It's a daily choice to watch, to speak, to act. The red shirts that now line schools from coast to coast are more than fabric. They are a warning to anyone who would abuse power and a promise to every child that they will be seen, heard, and protected. But promises only last if we keep them alive. That means showing up when it's uncomfortable, voting when it feels hopeless, speaking when it's risky. Change doesn't come because we hope. It comes because we refuse to leave things as they are. So let Jalen's words echo in every home. I didn't yell because I wanted the world to hear him, not me. We have heard him. Now it's our turn to speak. Watch the full story, feel the truth, and help carry it further. Subscribe to this channel, like this video, and share it with everyone you know. Because the more people who see, the fewer who can say they didn't know. And once you know, you have a choice. Make the right one.